now. Right, well, hello YouTube. I have a very special video today because I am joined by Carnades, who I guess needs no introduction in that if you're watching my channel you probably know who this is, but you know, it's a fellow YouTube philosopher, and you know, I will include a link in the description and so on. Is there anything you need to say by way of introduction about yourself?
Nothing too much. I would say the same about you, that you are, when I look at my channel, for anyone that is aware of YouTube's analytics, and I look for other channels that your viewers watch, Kane B is the top other channel, so I expect you don't need much of an introduction for my viewers either. But yeah, no, very, very excited to be here, very excited to chat today.
Okay, yeah, great. So, I mean, I guess I should say this came about because, well, actually, the reason why it came about is because several people had asked me, hey, you should get in touch with Carnades and have a discussion. No, I really...
proceeded to be very bad at responding to emails for a long time. To be clear for anyone out there that has been pestering me for this, I am definitely the blockade of this happening, just with other things going on in my life. But I'm so glad that it actually got around to happening.
Yeah, and I guess our the plan at least was to have a conversation about well, I guess skepticism and rationality, broadly speaking. I mean, obviously, I'm happy to, you know, follow the conversation wherever it happens to go. But I think that was the plan,
yeah.
right?
Yeah, that's definitely the plan. Before we jump into the content, I wanted to ask you a softball question, just because I'm curious. Looking at it now, what is the story behind your YouTube icon of the plague mask doctor, the Dr. Beaky there? I'm just curious.
Oh yeah, now this kind of annoys me, not your question, but just this whole situation, because I've had this icon from the, like, way back when I first started the channel many years ago, and the reason is very straightforward. I think that plague doctors look cool. And I'm interested. I have a minor interest in like that sort of historical period. You know, so and like plague and disease and stuff. It's just like a minor interest of mine. So that was why I chose it. There wasn't really anything more to it than that. But the problem is that because of COVID, now everybody thinks, everybody who's not familiar with me from before thinks that, oh, that's kind of a response to the COVID situation. And it's not. It's a lot more like personal, and it's just like my own personal interest in plague doctors and disease and, you know, that part of history. So it's nothing to do with COVID at all. And it's annoying that it looks that way to others, but I don't care, right? I'm keeping it as it is. I'm not going to change it because I like it.
It's iconic. It's a cool style. I like it. It's very identifiable. It's very clear. Okay, anyway, I just wanted to start off with that before we dig too much into the philosophy. Get that out of the way.
Yeah. Okay.
So I think one of the, so starting in with skepticism, I'll talk a little bit about kind of where, when I say skepticism, what I mean by that, and then we can talk a little bit about some of the things we've gone back and forth on. I also watched the video in the chat that you had on Zen skepticism, which I thought was a very interesting position and not exactly the position that aligns with mine. So I'd say when I think of my version of skepticism, I think of something that looks a lot more like Pyrrhonian skepticism than either academic skepticism or kind of Zen skepticism. And I'd make those distinctions a little bit as follows, where academic skeptics are those that are actively kind of denying the proposition that knowledge is possible. They're assenting to the claim that you cannot have any knowledge, knowledge is impossible, throw it out the window, and providing arguments to the effect of that. Pyrrhonian skeptics are somewhere in the vein of lacking any beliefs in general. So lacking beliefs about even things like whether or not knowledge is possible, all of that kind of thing. And then Zen skeptics, at least from my understanding of the conversation you had, seem even further down the line of not even representing the world in a particular way. We don't have to get into a conversation of that, but just to kind of position myself a little bit in that.
Yeah.
And so I know one of the conversations inevitably that this goes to is kind of around belief. Why would Pyrrhonian skeptics not have any beliefs? Is that even possible? Could one kind of walk through the world without belief? So just putting that out there as kind of the position that I'm starting with or coming from here.
Yeah. Okay. Great. And as well, I mean, as I mentioned in our email exchange, I suppose that the issue for me is like, okay, I just to step back a bit, actually, I should say,
Sure.
I do wonder if, like, how deep our disagreement is going to end up being, because I wonder if this might just, ultimately come down to like different ways of using terms like belief. But my understanding of the kind of skeptical position you have explained here is that it involves a suspension of judgment, right? So,
Yeah.
okay, you're not actually claiming that people don't have knowledge, but it is just a general suspension of judgment, and what that amounts to is no beliefs. And I guess my problem with this is that it seems to me that we need to have beliefs. We need to represent the world as being one way or the other in order to kind of take actions. In order to act in the world. So like, just to take a random example, let's say that I'm at the top of a building and I want to get down to the bottom of the building. Well, I don't just walk out the window, and part of the reason why I don't walk out the window is because I believe that doing so will kill me.
Yeah.
And so I don't want to die, right? And so now, when I say that I believe that walking out the window will kill me, I do want to be clear that I'm not certain about that. I mean, I'm very familiar with the problem of induction and all of that, so I am aware that maybe I could step out the window and just, float softly to the ground. But in some
Someone
sense,
jump out of a window above you with a parachute. Who knows?
Right, exactly.
But yeah.
So in some sense, right, I'm representing the world as being a particular way. I'm accepting a certain kind of representation of the world, and then I'm using that to guide my action. Now, there are some contexts where I feel like I do just completely suspend judgment, where I like don't accept any particular representation of the world. For example, if you ask me a question about, say, the origin of the universe, has something always existed, or did something just pop into existence? Well, I have absolutely no idea whatsoever, and like I would say I just completely suspend judgment on that. But it doesn't really seem true to say that I have absolutely no idea about whether or not I'll die when I jump out the window, because I mean, well, I mean, I think I do, right? Like I'm accepting that representation, I'm acting on it, and it would also inform how I interact with other people. Like if I had a friend who was saying, "Hey, I'll just walk out the window," I would be like, "Whoa, wait, like really think about that."
I have beliefs about what walking out the window will do to you, and that they aren't desirable.
Yeah. So maybe we want to say that, like, I'm not certain about this. I don't even know if I would say I'm confident about it, but I certainly accept it in some sense, and I think that like that fundamentally is my issue with skepticism as just a general position, right? The idea of just suspending judgment about everything. It's like, well, okay, what do I do when I am confronted with the desire to get down from the top of the tall building? Yeah.
Totally. No, I think that's a good point, and I think it's apt that you use the window discussion, because I don't know where the story comes from, probably Diogenes Laertius, knowing his works, but of Pyrrho, the famous founder of Pyrrhonian skepticism, needing to be helped by his disciples from walking off of cliffs and these things, because he lacked any beliefs about the world, and so would just wander through the world and didn't have any beliefs around that. Probably a spurious story, but an apropos one, I think. So I think I have a couple thoughts with that. So I would say, from the perspective of a skeptic, and you'll probably anticipate this move, there are a range of propositional attitudes that one can have. So like I said, I want to separate myself from, I'm going to call it Zen skepticism. I'm not sure if this is a perfect encapsulation of the position, but a position where someone in their head doesn't have any representation of the world in any sense. You don't have kind of even the proposition half of propositional attitudes. And that's not necessarily the position that I'm coming from. It's the second half of that, the attitude of accepting as true, where I think the skeptic, at least the Pyrrhonian skeptic, comes into a little bit of conflict there. And so you might imagine, say, I'm sitting reading a book. I was reading Hogfather, Terry Pratchett's Hogfather for the holidays, of course. And as I'm reading a book, I imagine a world of what's going on. In my mind, I have a representation of a fantasy world that isn't real at all. And it seems that I can have that representation that perhaps our Zen skeptic doesn't have, but also at the same time not assent to that representation being true. So I think that the Pyrrhonian skeptic can have, and often does have, representations of a world, whether that's a fantasy world or the real world, or things they desire, a state of the world they desire, that are those representations. So I think there's that. The next, so how do we get from that to not walking off the top of the building? It seems to me that there is a smorgasbord of relationships that one can have to kind of propositions. You can accept them as true, certainly, and a lot of philosophy does concentrate on belief, but you can do all of these other things. I can imagine that they're true, I can desire that they're true, I can hypothesize or guess that they're true, and say, maybe they're true, I'm going to try this because I think they might be true, but I'm not sure. And so have that kind of intermediate relationship between accepting as true and saying, I don't even represent the world in this way. I have no relationship to that proposition whatsoever. And so I think there's a certain level of these range of, you can wonder something. I can be, for example, going to the specific case of the building. I'm afraid that walking off the building is going to kill me. Even if I don't believe that it's true, I can be afraid that that's the case. I could be afraid that a spider is going to kill me, and so I don't know, go down into my basement. And I don't believe that that's true, but it still informs my actions, and it still informs the way that I act. So the two pieces of, I do think the skeptic can represent the world in certain ways without necessarily having kind of that belief relationship to those representations. And it does seem to me that there are other relationships that we can have other than belief that the skeptic might have access to that would let us kind of move through the world. But like I said, I would expect you that's a common, I know that's a common move that skeptics use. So I'd be curious what your thoughts are in response to that, of that kind of expanding of possible propositional attitudes.
Yeah, I mean, so I guess there's sort of two things I would say about that. I mean, so first of all, okay, I would say, okay, let's, consider what these propositional attitudes are and, the sort of relationship they might have to action. So, you use the example of reading a fiction and imagining that something is true. But it doesn't seem like imagining things is going to motivate me to do anything in particular, because, I mean, I can imagine anything at all. And in fact, I do. If I'm at the top of a building and there's a really boring meeting or something going on, then I might sit and imagine myself flying out the window, occupy myself in that kind of way. But that doesn't, again, I'm not going to act on that. Maybe a bit maybe another option would be to say, well, I can sort of provisionally accept something as a hypothesis or something along those lines, hypothesize it or propose it. But even then, it seems like there are lots of things that I might hypothesize, but I still wouldn't want to actually act on them. I can, if a chemist produces a new drug or something like that, they might hypothesize that this drug will, I don't know, cure heart disease, let's say, right? But, you're not just going to immediately start giving that drug to people. You do a whole bunch of other tests. And then there's a point that comes after you've done those tests where the attitude seems to change. So, okay, we've got this new drug and we're hypothesizing that this will cure heart disease. Maybe it's been shown to have positive effects in mice or something. So then we do some further tests, and eventually there comes a point where, you know, we shift from just hypothesizing it to accepting it in a stronger sense, where we're like, okay, we can act on this now, and we can actually get this drug out there and give it to people. And it seems like that change, you know, there's a point where we move from just considering a proposition to, in some sense, accepting it. And and at that point, I feel like, you know, is that, are we, that doesn't seem like a skeptical attitude to me. It doesn't seem like we're just suspending judgment anymore. But maybe I'm missing something there. So yeah, that's one point I would make to that.
Sure.
Yeah.
So one thing I might say in response is, it seems there's a difference to me in terms of the world of, there's one set of questions that particularly the Pyrrhonian skeptic faces of, how do you act in the world? You are someone that claims to have no beliefs. How is it possible that you physically do anything and don't just sit around twiddling your thumbs all day or walk off a building? And then I think there's a second question of, how do you do things that are sensible, in the sense of, sure, okay, we see you taking actions. How do you do things that make sense, that follow rational? So starting with the first one of possible to act, it seems to me that, at least in terms of hypotheses, take that as a propositional attitude of provisionally acting as if something's true in order to test whether or not it's true. A definition that I'm pulling out of my ear, so if it doesn't work, apologies. But something like that, of, you're saying, I don't know, you're placed in front of a random machine with a bunch of buttons and you're trying to make it do something. You would test out buttons, and it seems those hypotheses could lead you to take actions, right? You have a hypothesis about, I'm going to try this button, I'm going to try that button, similar to the scientists testing out with the mouse. And so it seems that at least the propositional attitude of being able to hypothesize can at least push against the concern for the Pyrrhonian skeptic that you would sit around and do nothing, because it seems you at least can act based on hypotheses. Now, I think the second question, which I think you rightly raise, of, okay, so maybe if you can act based on these hypotheses, what about when you hypothesize something, you run a bunch of tests, and it seems to be working, do you ever shift over to that status of belief? And it seems to me, encountering many people in the world, that people do shift over to that status of belief. I think what makes the Pyrrhonian skeptic different is an unwillingness to take that step, of that unwillingness to shift over to acceptance or belief, whether that's a complete unwillingness. And one of the good and bad things about being a Pyrrhonian skeptic is, I'm not saying that it's a good thing to be a Pyrrhonian skeptic, because I don't have a belief about whether or not it's a good thing. I just lack all beliefs about it. And so it might just be that my brain's weird and it doesn't let me accept things as true, and it makes me kind of hold things back. But it's the state of being that I seem to be in. And I try to look for ways that people do actually fully accept things as true. But I never seem to take that last step, or be able to take that last step. And that might be a bad way to act, but I don't know if it is. So I'd one, make that distinction between, is it possible to act based on kind of all these other propositional attitudes? Can the Pyrrhonian do something other than sit and twiddle their thumbs? And then, does it make sense to actually move that last step towards belief? And then I think there might be a viable argument of, perhaps the Pyrrhonian should move to that last step to belief. But I think that the challenge is then you have to build up a lot of things around how you should act and all of the, I don't know, the structures under that. Anyway.
Yeah, I think that's a useful distinction. I still think I would want to push back a little bit on this point about possibility, because, so, and again, maybe this is a failure of my imagination, but I think that when I imagine cases where we act on something that we're just hypothesizing, or maybe something else, maybe something we're wondering or considering or whatever, I think that always takes place against a background of propositions that are believed, or maybe not even believed, but like there's some sense in which we are accepting them more deeply. So like you use this example of the machine, and you know there's buttons on the machine and so on. So, okay, I'm confronted with the machine, and I might hypothesize that, like, pulling this lever will have this effect. But then I still seem to have a belief that, like, okay, if I move my arm out in front of me and hold the lever and pull it down, something will happen.
Beliefs that I have hands and these kinds of things.
Well, maybe not actually. I mean, I'm like, so I actually am increasingly attracted to just being an outright skeptic about whether there is an external world in any substantial sense. I think it's entirely possible to just view the world as being like a computer game, for instance. Mm-hmm. So, maybe there are just no material objects, right? But there are still objects in some broad sense of the term. Like, okay, I have hands. Maybe they're not material objects, but there's like a stream of sensory data, and when I move my hands in particular ways, particular things happen. I think I still sort of struggle to comprehend, and again, I mean, this might just be a failure of my imagination, but I still struggle to comprehend, like, just not accepting anything. And I understand there are situations in life where, we just have to take a shot in the dark, where we maybe have no idea what's going to happen. Like if you're lost in the woods and you come across like a fork in the path, you just have to take a guess, right? And I mean, you can act on that guess. You might actually have no idea. You might not even have a hypothesis, but you just take a guess and you just act on that guess. But even so, it seems like, well, I still have the belief in that situation that when I put my leg forward, that's going to result in me moving forward and not in the world exploding or something like that, right? There's any number of things.
Turning into a fish, something crazy.
Right. Like, can we understand all of that as just merely hypothesizing? I don't know.
I think it's a great question. It's a great place to go to. I think for a skeptic who's really coming to the world with lacking full beliefs, any actions that they are actively taking are perhaps built on many different hypotheses about the way that the world works. It seems that when I don't know, think this thing, the arm appears to move in this way. It seems that happens. But if one day that stopped happening, I don't know, because I got my arm cut off or because I woke up and realized I was a brain in a vat, whatever, it wouldn't be a sudden like, oh, I have to rethink my beliefs. It would be a, that's something that I can give up. That was something that was, I had a provisional relationship with that proposition. And I think this, and this is where we may get into shades of gray where our positions aren't as far apart, but it seems to me that one can have a lot of hypotheses or wonderments about the world or these general kind of weaker propositional attitudes that could fall apart more easily. And what worries me about things like belief is that it seems that beliefs are things that people often end up holding tightly to. When presented with evidence to the contrary, they often reject the evidence and don't reject the beliefs that they're holding on to. And that may be a worry from me. And there seem to be people in the world that are able to reject beliefs that they hold on to. But I think one of the things of building your set of actions out of a set of hypotheses, I don't know, structure of straw that you're willing to pull anything out of, as opposed to something that you couldn't, if a belief is so central to your kind of worldview that you couldn't admit that was possible, I think is freeing in some ways for the skeptic and allows them to react to and formulate new hypotheses quickly and not be kind of surprised if one day they woke up and we're in the matrix or we're in some kind of skeptical scenario. It comes as not a kind of horrible shock and surprise, but or they found out a fact about the world that completely disagreed with a hypothesis that you hold. It seems that you're better able to adapt to those situations. But I don't know. And I don't know if hypothesis is the perfect thing. I think there's a lot of attitudes that I probably have that aren't hypothesized, that are hope. I hope that when I walk out of, I don't know, my house in the morning, that there's going to be ground there. I'm not sure I perfectly hypothesize it, but there's lots of things that built in there. So that was a bit of a ramble, but I do think that there's a way, yes, you would have to have a lot of hypotheses, and yes, you have to have a lot of these propositional attitudes, but I think people have a lot of beliefs that are in that place. So I don't see why it's particularly strange for us to have a different type of propositional attitude that's perhaps more weakly held in place of those beliefs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't think that was rambling. That made perfect sense to me. So I suppose this might be where maybe we are just coming down to a semantic difference. So my beliefs, I would consider myself a fallibilist. I'm not certain of any of my beliefs. And I'm not sure that I could even say that I'm particularly confident about them anymore. I used to be, but I increasingly feel doubt about them. But I suppose the way I see it is that, okay, there's a distinction between different ways of thinking about things, and there's one very important way of thinking about things where we are, broadly speaking, representing the world as being a certain way, right? And I'm calling that belief, right? Now, because sometimes in some domains I just don't represent the world in one way or another, like with the example of the origin of the universe. Okay, I just have no idea. So there's something important about that, and I'm calling that belief, but I don't see that as requiring certainty or confidence. When my beliefs turn out to be wrong, it's, well, sometimes maybe surprising, but it's often quite fun to find out that you're wrong about things and to change your mind. And so, yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't know. What do you think? Do you think that we differ significantly on this point, or is this just a semantic difference?
I think it's a bit of a challenge, because I do think that we're I don't know, coming to a similar position from different directions, perhaps using different words, but ending up in a very similar place. I think that there may be differences yet in the. I think the skeptic often still ends up in situations where they do. In your mind, you can represent the world in many different ways, and you're not kind of wed to one specific thing. So you think something, I don't know, a horrible tragedy happens to you, and you're in a situation of saying, wow, this horrible thing has happened to me. I think that skepticism offers, whether it's a death of a family member, a horrible, political event in your country, whatever. And I think the skeptic has a way of saying that, in a calming sense, it's possible I can represent the world in a way where everyone's just in the matrix and this didn't happen, or I'm a brain in a vat and this didn't happen. And those are all possible things. And I don't know that this hypothesis is correct, that particular thing. And so you're having at the same time kind of multiple ways of representing the world, and you might choose to act on one of those ways that's built out of hypotheses as opposed to something else, but you can have those relationships. Now that you may say that, oh, of course people imagine that and that brings them solace and brings them comfort, but I think this is one of those things that digs back to, I don't know, some of the foundational origins of skepticism as a way to try to find peace, or try to find kind of an ataraxia or whatever, of trying to get to a place where you're not being pulled by things that would make you unhappy, or beliefs that might drive you one way. So that might be one way in which skepticism, you can still have some level of other representations. It's not that I have a set of hypotheses and that's the only set of hypotheses I have about the world, and I'm acting on those and I'm only acting on those. I think there can be other representations that you have. You can have two competing sets of hypotheses that you're not sure which one is correct, and be acting and be thinking through each of those. So I don't know if that it would be acceptable to your framework, or if that's a bridge too far in some sense of kind of having these competing ways of thinking about the world, that one could say, well, at least that's a possible way that the world could be, and so maybe this thing that happened isn't so bad, or maybe that's a possible way the world could be, and so maybe I'm wrong, or maybe I can think more expansively about these things. And maybe that's the position that you're at with saying that things aren't certain. So yeah, we may be coming to a similar position from different directions, but I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I like this kind of example. Okay, I'm just going to go on, maybe this might sound like a bit of a tangent, but I'm going to come back around to the point. So, there's this really nice article by David Chalmers called, I think it's called The Matrix is Metaphysics. And he makes this point that a lot of what seem to be skeptical hypotheses, according to him, are actually just metaphysical hypotheses. So he says that if it turns out that we're all in the Matrix, actually, from a kind of purely practical point of view, that doesn't really make any difference. But more importantly, it's still going to turn out that there are, trees and cars and other people and so on. It's just that the underlying metaphysical nature or structure of these things is different to what we might have thought. So it turns out that, trees and cars are not material objects made of protons and neutrons. Ultimately, fundamentally, they're just lines of code or something like that. So, so he kind of raises this challenge to skeptical hypotheses where it's like, well, actually, no, this is just a metaphysical debate. It's like the debate between physicalists and idealists or whatever. But we can still be realists about the objects that we talk about, on a sort of everyday basis. But that kind of argument only goes so far because there are other skeptical hypotheses, like the hypothesis that, well, maybe like everything I'm experiencing is just a hallucination. Now, on that hypothesis, it's going to turn out that there aren't any other people. There are no other minds, right? And that has significant consequences. That makes a difference because, and it might initially seem like it makes a difference in a way that would be quite bad because, if there are no other minds, then how can I form connections with other people? How can, how what does it mean to love somebody if it turns out that all of this is just a hallucination? That's awful. But and this is, I guess, coming back to the point. It seems I've increasingly felt like actually this offers quite a lot of solace because there are lots of situations in life where things would really be improved if there weren't any other people. I mean, so, when you are in a situation where maybe you're encountering new people, I mean, I'm quite introverted, right? So I'm not necessarily the best in social situations. I find it a bit awkward. I find that actually, if I just kind of rehearse the skeptical arguments in my head and convince myself that I'm just hallucinating all of this, I sort of stop caring, and I'm like, I'll just go into the room and meet the new people and talk to them, and it's not such a big deal because I don't think they really exist. I come to accept that they don't really exist, and I go into there and I can just interact with them fine, and it doesn't bother me anymore. And then when I am in a different situation, maybe I'm with a friend and we seem to have some sort of deep connection, I don't have to continue believing the hallucination hypothesis. I can just let my sort of natural tendency to believe in an external world and to believe that there are other people, I can just let that reassert itself. So I found that I quite like the ability to slip from one set of beliefs to another as they serve me, as they are practically useful. I don't know if that was exactly the sort of thing you were talking about, because of course I'm framing this in terms of belief, right? Like I see this as me just changing my beliefs as it helps me. But maybe it's a similar sort of thing. I don't know.
Yeah, I would definitely think it's a similar sort of thing. I think it's that sense of, and once again, I go back to the ancient Greeks and their pursuit of eudaimonia or whatever, of this sense of pursuing peace or pursuing that. I think that having uncertainty about the world, I think there are some people that get very uncomfortable with uncertainty, and given our current situation globally with the pandemic and everything, I think that can create a great deal of stress. But I think if people become comfortable with a certain level of uncertainty, it can be freeing in a sense. You can say, I could be really anxious about interacting with these people. I could be really anxious about this, endless stream of depressing news stories that I'm reading, whatever. Or I could say, well, maybe these people aren't real. Maybe these news stories are all in my head. And I think that can bring a certain level of kind of comfort. And you could have and once again, as you said, this may be just us describing things in different terms of saying, well, I'm hopeful that this isn't true, or I'm hopeful that this is going on, or I wonder if perhaps that I'm just hallucinating right now, and so maybe I wonder if I shouldn't be as stressed or as fearful. Whereas when you're interacting with an individual, I might describe that as hypothesizing, but you might end saying, well, I hypothesize that maybe the rest of the world's real. Maybe there's an external world. Maybe this is a separate individual that I'm actually having a true connection with. And so I might describe that as kind of separate kind of propositional attitudes that I could have towards different representations of the world, and you could describe that as changing your beliefs to fit a situation or to work. But I do think there's a lot of similarities there. Going through that.
Yeah. So one thing, another thing I wanted to ask, and this kind of goes back to when you were talking about the many different propositional attitudes we can have to things, is so, okay, right, there's this whole host of different propositional attitudes we can have, and those are all accessible to the skeptic. And I mean, maybe you have touched on this a little bit, but I do wonder then, well, okay, what's wrong with just adding belief to that, right? Like, so if we're acknowledging that we can wonder about things and hypothesize things and and hope for things, what's the problem with just having belief as one among many of these propositional attitudes? I mean, because I should say that, like, when I see myself as like changing my beliefs, I mean, I do that in very specific contexts, but I would still say that, like, I don't know, I want to say that I still make a commitment, and it might be quite a strong commitment to the representation in question. So when I'm with a very close friend and we seem to be talking and there seems to be a connection, I am like very strongly, deeply committed to the belief that this person is really there and there really is another mind there, and like I don't know, I just kind of accept it, right, and act on it, even if in other situations I might be willing to give it up. So I guess I see I suppose I would see belief as being one among many useful things I can do. It's one among many useful things that are accessible to me. What's the problem with that?
Great question. And I think it's weird from the position of particularly the Pyrrhonian skeptic, because it's not like I believe that belief is wrong, because I don't have any beliefs to start with. And so I think there's a couple of ways I can come at this. One of them is from just the first person perspective of, it seems to me that, like, I go out there, I try to believe things, I end up with all of these doubts that come pouring down, whether that's a worry about maybe this is a skeptical scenario, maybe it's something more realistic in the world of maybe I've just understood this situation wrong or misinterpreted something or don't have a good understanding of the way the world works. Whatever that is, these doubts come pouring down on me, and I find myself unable to take that step towards, oh, I'm going to accept this as true. Oh, I'm going to accept this as a belief. And so there's this kind of psychological level of, I seem to be, when I get to that point, all of these doubts pour down on me, and I say, oh, I couldn't accept that as a belief. It feels uncomfortable. And it's not a normative way to say everyone should be like this. It's just a kind of fact of, it seems to me that even if I tried to accept the belief, and for my particular kind of skepticism, I think it's a kind of skepticism where I would love to accept things as true. I want to find certainty in the world. I want to find things that could feel like solid knowledge, but I am unsuccessful at that for any range of reasons, because of whether it's philosophical doubts or practical doubts about my understanding of the world. So I think there's one path of that. But then there's another conversation around, should other people act like this? Well, I don't know what other people should do, but it does seem to me that I always struggle when you have some level of someone coming to something and saying, well, I believe this because of a particular thing or because of this, and this. And I look at that argument, and the first thing my mind can go to is all of the possible flaws that are there. And so I try to say, well, let's assume that this is true. Let's try to find a way to come to this belief and assume something and try to work out a justification. And inevitably, I get stymied by all of these skeptical possibilities and say, oh, maybe I'll just go back to the comfortable, I don't know, cloud of doubt, because I don't seem to be able to even justify those sufficiently for myself. And so that's one of the reasons that something like belief is a hard propositional attitude to add to at least my arsenal of saying that when I come to something like that, I say, oh, all these doubts creep in. I try to come up with reasons to have that belief, and it doesn't work. And my brain says, nope, let's go with doubt. Let's go with a weaker thing rather than accepting as true. So maybe that's just a psychological flaw on my part of being a weird human that's out here wandering around, and I've just found this wonderful philosophical position to describe the state of affairs of the way my mind works. But it does seem that for any individual belief, there are plenty of skeptical reasons one could have for doubting it. And so it's hard for me to take that last step of believe in this thing. I don't know.
Yeah, okay. I think I have two things to say. I'm curious. You said that you would like certainty, that there's at least part of you that wants to have belief. Why is that? I'm just curious.
Great question. I don't know. I think there's a desire. Perhaps it's a desire from a childhood in a state of a state where it seems like the world works effectively and everything works exactly like it is said on, I don't know, Saturday morning cartoons or something, that things seem to follow rules and you can justify the claims that you make, and we don't, I don't know, I think of this sometimes in terms of, I don't know, paradigm shifts in science, where it seems like you have a particular set of rules that the universe follows. And it seems when you're, I don't know, taught in an elementary school science class, these are the laws that physics follows, this is the way things behave. And then as you learn more, you say, well, we're not really sure about that. And well, we're still working on that. And well, we kind of thought about classical mechanics, but then we took this huge shift to quantum mechanics and we threw out some things. And it goes back to a sense of, oh, wow, that feels like we're really uncertain about these things. The more information you get, the more it seems like we're not sure. And I think it's, I don't know, perhaps if I can psychoanalyze myself, a desire of returning to a childhood state where things seemed like they made sense and the world was this nice, clean, I don't know, it was clear there were things that you could go down and you could prove that this is definitively true for sure. So I don't know where that desire comes from. Like I said, I can kind of psychoanalyze myself a little bit to get a sense, but I don't know. But it's a desire that I have. I think many people desire to have knowledge or certain understanding. But like I said, I also see benefits of being a skeptic. And so there's a little bit of that balance.
Yeah, okay. I was just wondering. I mean,
Yeah.
I get it. I think that there are many domains in which knowledge is terribly limited, and I don't particularly like that. You know, I tend to be very skeptical with respect to metaphysics. I have a fairly empiricist sort of orientation, and that kind of annoys me. You know, like I would really like to know the fundamental nature and structure of reality. But yeah, I was just curious about that.
Or even something like ethics. I feel that it would be great if we could go up to people and say, no, you're doing something that's wrong and I can prove it. Look at my, I don't know, 10-page logical proof that shows you genocide is wrong or whatever. In my idealized world where that would be an effective argument against someone committing genocide. But I feel there's a desire to be able to say, no, we can prove this. We can show you that this thing is this way. And particularly with things like ethics, I think that becomes even more challenging on another level.
I don't know what this says about me, but I actually have no desire at all for moral realism to be true. I'm very happy being a moral anti-realist. So for some reason, I have the desire to like know facts about, I don't know, whether or not there are laws of nature, but when it comes to ethics, I'm
you're
I'm just cool with it.
With the lack of a kind of set of laws. I feel that, and I was realizing this when I was watching one of your other videos where you're chatting with someone who I'm going to forget now, talking about how a lot of philosophy is full of, or a lot of the disciplines of philosophy are full of moral realists in some way, and yet a lot of the YouTubers that exist out there are often anti-realists or these things. And I was thinking of a similar realization I've had with skepticism of, I feel when I have encountered or worked in academic philosophy, there are a lot of dogmatists out there, as a skeptic would define dogmatists, people who aren't skeptics. And yet when I go on YouTube or other channels or kind of alternative places or locations for philosophy, I feel I find a lot of the, I don't know, the viewpoints that are discarded offhand by some of the academics, but I don't know.
I think that, I wonder if the reason for this might be that in philosophy, obviously if you're doing philosophy professionally, there's like this extreme specialization. So, you know, like I might say do philosophy of biology, and then, I don't know, I work on, you know, say different interpretations of natural selection or something like that. And, you know, maybe for people kind of working in those fields, it's like, well, you know, there are certain questions that are maybe not available to you if you take a skeptical stance. I mean, so certainly I'm saying this, so I'm an anti-realist about science, right? So I tend to view scientific theories as just tools, instruments for predicting and controlling observable phenomena, right? So in that respect, I'm pretty skeptical, okay, in that particular respect. But that does mean that, I mean, I'm not going to be making a contribution to a whole load of debates in philosophy of science, like, for instance, interpretations of quantum mechanics. I mean, I can take part in it, right? But I'm never going to commit myself to any position there. And maybe that's why. Maybe it feels, there might be like a kind of, what's the word? You know, when there's like a psychological conflict. What the hell is the word for it? It's a really common thing.
Cognitive dissonance.
Cognitive dissonance, I think that's the one, yeah. Between like holding that sort of skeptical position, but then spending, you know, your entire life essentially arguing for a particular position in that domain. I don't know. That might explain it.
No, I think that's a very interesting point and a very good one. I think there's a lot of I am always interested when I read philosophers who are talking about particularly applied ethics when they end up in a situation where they feel like they have to come up with some explanation for the fact that they're not out there doing whatever applied ethics they're trying to advocate for. Rather, they're sitting at home and being a philosopher. And I feel that there's a certain level of, I don't know, bias towards you have to make a space for yourself in some way. I don't know. I think of the likes of Peter Singer, or even you look at Plato and the philosopher kings. If philosophers are going to be the ones that are making all the rules, of course they're going to make a place for philosophy itself in whatever world they're constructing. And so I think there's this certain level of bias towards, I'm not going to take a position that's going to mean I'm out of a job, essentially. I can't take a position that tears down the house because I live in the house.
Right.
But
okay. Well, hey, maybe
this is far from the topic, but
well, I mean, maybe that's okay. Look, it's an interesting conversation. Yeah.
And it's interesting. I mean, clearly we're individuals that are doing philosophy on YouTube, and so we're a community, a small community of philosophers, but a community of philosophers that's doing things in a different way than the traditional kind of academic philosophy. So I think we have a unique perspective, perhaps, to bring to that.
Okay, well, I guess actually, I was going to say to get us back on the topic, but I think that we've kind of covered the topic of belief and propositional attitudes. I don't know if there was anything more you wanted to say or ask about that, but
no, happy to move on to another topic on the list, or go any direction that you feel.
Actually, I should ask, how much time do you have? Is there any particular time you need to get away?
I mean, I would say at least an hour, probably not too much more than 2 hours, but okay. Whatever works.
Yep, that's cool. So I guess I know. So one area where I know that we have disagreed, and this also relates to the second thing that I wanted to ask about something you said, which I've now forgotten because the conversation ended up moving on. But I know there was a point, like about 10 minutes ago, where I was about to say, okay, there's two things I want to say there.
Sorry.
So what okay, so it was about this point about justification, right? Because you have said that the issue for you is that you don't form beliefs because you find justification just sort of slipping away. Well, there's like no justification. You're immediately confronted with this tsunami of skeptical doubts.
Exactly.
That's right, yeah. And so my sort of perspective on this is, like, again, in some ways, maybe we don't really differ that much, because my view on this is that what's required for rational belief is really just a matter of you need to make sure that your beliefs are consistent, at least with respect to whatever logical system you're accepting, because there are a whole bunch of different logical systems. But you know, consistency is a constraint, and beliefs need to be such that they support successful action. But you know, within that, I see belief as being really a matter of people's temperaments or wills, and I don't think that beliefs really require justification. And so, yeah, I think this is, again, like, I wonder if maybe my position is sort of just conceding everything the skeptic will want. But that's sort of my take on rationality, right? Like, there's no requirement that rational beliefs be proportioned to the available justification or evidence, because actually the available justification is never there. Beliefs always involve kind of taking stabs in the dark and going beyond what the evidence itself will compel us to accept, if that makes sense. And I just then like accept that. I'm like, okay, well, fine. You know, turns out beliefs don't really require justification, at least not in anything like the sense that philosophers have traditionally thought.
So, very interesting. Good. Let's go on to this topic. So, one of the questions I have for kind of this idea of what you got to do for beliefs is you have to have consistent beliefs. They got to be internally consistent. They have to somehow support successful action. And I know we talked about this a little bit in writing. Is I get worried that I get worried about a range of things. clearly, my wave of doubts just washes over me. I get worried about things like individuals that have very few beliefs that support a certain level of successful action, or perhaps have very few goals, and so successful action can be minimally defined, but those beliefs are astronomically incorrect. So people who believe that they, I don't know, are an omnipotent deity, but don't particularly want to do anything, and so all they do is wander about their day acting like a normal human, but deeply believe that they could do anything if they wanted to. It seems like one could spin a story where those beliefs are at least internally consistent, but are grossly insane. So there's one level of that. There's a certain level of I'm worried about disagreeing, and I'll just spit all these out and then feel to respond to whatever quotes you're both. But there's a certain level of the concern of disagreements, of I worry about individuals. If all it takes is your beliefs to be consistent, then we can have all these individuals with pockets of beliefs that are internally consistent, that are rafts floating on the sea, and that support their actions, but are completely inconsistent and don't lend themselves to people being able to settle disagreements. And so that there's a worry in me in that. And then there's, I think, the worry that we mentioned when we were going back and forth of the kind of doxastic ethics of, is it good to, and like, I'm a skeptic, I don't know if it's good, I'm worried that it's not good. Is it good to hold beliefs that are in some way unjustified, because that might lead to, in some way, bad action? So those are kind of three things that I don't know, give me the heebie-jeebies about saying it's okay, just as long as your beliefs are consistent and they support your actions, that you're good to go.
Yeah, I don't know. Am I saying am I really that open-minded? I'm not sure. I mean, consistency is quite a strong constraint for most people. Yeah. So, well, I might as well. I'll deal with the first one first, and you know, if we have a discussion, we can come back to the other two, I suppose.
Great.
Yeah. So, I think that these sorts of examples. So, the example you suggested of somebody who believes that they are omnipotent, but who just doesn't really have any goals. So, you know, that belief is never challenged. Because, of course, you know, the obvious thing to say about that is, well, if you believe that you're omnipotent, then that's going to be immediately refuted once you try to do something and then you fail to do it. That's just like, that's going to immediately show that you're not omnipotent, and so you would be inconsistent if you maintained that belief. But I think that the issue I have with these sorts of examples is, it's, on the one hand, I should say that I think actually just prepared to bite the bullet in at least some of these cases, right? And just accept that, yeah, these people might count as rational. But I'm not sure how many cases I really need to bite the bullet on, because it's very hard for me to like imagine what a person would be like who actually has beliefs like this. So, you know, if we're thinking of like a person who believes that they're omnipotent, well, presumably they're going to be, you know, doing stuff, right? Like they might get up and, you know, go and get food or something, or maybe they desire to have food, and it's immediately going to be clear to them. The minute they form that desire, it will immediately become clear to them that they can't just, you know, will the food into existence. They have to actually get up and go and acquire it. Now, of course, you could say, well, you know, let's imagine a person who just doesn't have any desires like that. But now I'm thinking, you know, what the hell, what am I imagining? I mean, I don't know what that sort of entity would be like. I don't know if that would even count as a person, you know, like, because even animals have certain basic sets of desires, and I mean, presumably they represent the world in particular ways. So to imagine an entity that just has such a small set of goals and beliefs, yeah, I'm not sure what it is that I'm really trying to conceive of. And I wonder if, I don't think I've ever met a person in real life like that. And so even if we can imagine it as a kind of thought experiment, I wonder if it's really a problem if my view of rationality maybe it has counterintuitive consequences in such cases. Like, do I really need to have a view of rationality that applies to like every situation that we can possibly imagine?
Yeah,
I'm not really sure about that, right? Like, maybe I do, but I'm.
I think it's a good point, and I think it's, yeah, there's probably few people in the world that believe they're omnipotent but don't want to do anything. But I do think we can end up with people who have consistent but still troubling views. You'd think of someone who, I don't know, believes that they have a, I don't know, direct line of communication with a deity, with God or whatever God they have. They believe strongly in that and believe that they receive divine revelation from that deity. And those divine revelations are surprisingly consistent and end up being completely internally consistent, but are still, I don't know, telling them perhaps to do very harmful things or dangerous things. I'm worried that someone who receives that, and it's not that they can do anything, but rather they have the belief that they are receiving what they should do, true facts about the way the world works, or what they should act on, true facts about good and evil, from a deity. It's a little worrying to me that they might be considered rational, because I think there are, I know, softer examples of someone that has internally consistent beliefs that are still, we still might be worried. There might be more of a bullet for you to bite for that. Because sure, I'll take the point that someone who believes they're omnipotent but doesn't do anything, maybe they don't exist, maybe your system doesn't need to account for them. But it does seem that there are people who, for whatever reason, maybe they're schizophrenic and they believe that there are aliens that are talking to them, but within their world, everything is consistent. It seems worrisome we're calling them rational, but maybe they should be called rational. I'm not sure.
Yeah, so actually, with the case of people who are like schizophrenic and so on, I think that we probably can find inconsistencies in, you know, like their, particularly when you consider what their like desires are. And remember, it's not just consistency. Like, I also have this requirement that beliefs have to like ultimately support successful action. But this point about people having a direct line to the deity, yeah, I think actually my view would allow that and would count that as within the boundaries of rationality. I don't really see that as biting much of a bullet, though, because I don't see that as being any more problematic than a whole load of things that are actually quite common in philosophy. I mean, if you look at people like, so a lot of people who are moral realists who want to be non-naturalist about it, people like Michael Hume, for instance, will say, well, like ultimately, we just have this kind of intuitive access to the moral facts, right? It's just based on intuition. Now, to me, that seems as like you just we just have this kind of intellectual sense of what the moral facts are. I mean, okay, I know that I'm simplifying here, but it may be a simplification. But ultimately, I think those sorts of views are no more plausible than people who think that they've got a direct line to God. I mean, to me, both of those views seem absurd, but I actually I don't know. I don't want to call them irrational. I think that I think that it's at least, like, let's say there's nothing wildly counterintuitive about saying that people like Michael Hume, even if I think they're wrong, they're still perfectly rational. So I think that's one point I would make. The point about harm, I'm not sure is a problem specific to me. So, so like it seems like somebody could, as a skeptic, hypothesize that they have a direct line to God, and then could act in ways that are, really awful. I mean, because presumably you could hypothesize almost anything, right? I mean, you could, couldn't somebody hypothesize that I don't know, this particular religion or this particular race of people are undermining the security of the country, and so they all need to be rounded up and kicked out. That's the only way of maintaining the security of the country. I mean, isn't that something that you could hypothesize? It's not as though people are just going to hypothesize good things, presumably. So I take your point that yes, certain beliefs that are harmful might come out as rational, but I don't think that that's a problem that's solved that the skeptic solves or avoids.
Okay, so I definitely take your points, and they're very good. I always approve of the general conclusion that most all philosophers are completely irrational, but so I might bite the bullet in the other direction. But I do think this leads a little bit into a bit of the conversation on disagreements, because I do think this is where a place where the skeptic might have a bit of a comparative advantage on some of these pieces as hypothesis as opposed to belief. So something around a skeptic were to hypothesize that a particular thing is very harmful that we generally think is not. So the example you provide of a particular ethnic group of people is undermining the security of the nation, and so the skeptic has a duty to go out and do great harm to them. Someone hypothesizes such. It seems to me that within the constraints of debate and these things, the skeptic could profess such an idea to someone else could give them a reason that it's wrong, and the skeptic would immediately say, oh, I doubt is my home, doubt is where I live, I'm going to doubt that belief and tear it back down and go back to a place of doubt. Whereas someone who takes that as strong, certain belief, not necessarily uncertain belief or somewhere in between, but strong, certain belief, they, when faced with disagreements or faced with issues, the place that they might go is towards doubling down, towards dismissing additional evidence as opposed to dismissing a belief that's central to a belief structure. And so I think there's a certain level, the skeptic has a bit of an advantage there around disagreements. But that said, I think there could certainly be skeptics that could act based on false hypotheses. Most hypotheses for a skeptic, probably most hypotheses are false. We don't know. And in doing so do harm. But I do think the comparative advantage comes when you actually have a discussion or debate about saying, I'm going to take this action, and someone says, here are 5 reasons you shouldn't. You say, okay, let me doubt that action, let me doubt those beliefs. Whereas I think someone that's holding tight to those beliefs might be in a different situation, or someone who kind of starts from a, foundationalist solid point of belief, and someone that starts from a foundationalist solid point of a different belief it seems to me those people can never settle their disagreements because they're both holding tight to some foundational idea, whether it's that, I don't know, this holy text is true, or that everything that the leprechaun on my shoulder tells me is true. Whatever that foundational belief is, it seems that that is a much more dangerous position to be in, because those people are never going to give up that foundational underlying belief, whereas the skeptic is much more willing to. But I do think that's a good, I don't know, critique that you offer.
Yeah, I think. I suppose I'm still not sure that, like, where the skeptic's advantage is, because I mean, so yeah, the skeptic will, be faced with arguments and evidence against the claim that, a particular ethnic group is a danger, but then on the other hand, they're also going to have a whole bunch of arguments and evidence against a claim like, you ought to be kind to people, or a claim like all humans have a certain degree of, I don't know, equality or something like that, right? Like, so, I mean, I suppose I'm not seeing why there would be any particular reason to favour one course of action rather than another. I mean, beyond just like, okay, we can say that people have certain temperaments. So, if I am, born into, if I just happen to be born with a compassionate sort of temperament, then yeah, maybe as a skeptic, I'm just going to go and act compassionately. But like, maybe I'm not, right? Maybe maybe I'm born with the sort of competitive, violent, aggressive kind of attitude, and that's what I will sort of default to. So yeah,
So I think it's an interesting point that you raise. I think that there's a certain level of, so I think the skeptic could make the case that there's a certain level of violence not coming from temperament, but coming from disagreements that couldn't be settled with rationality. But the idea of, if you have two people who have completely contrary beliefs as their foundational belief that they're holding to, they cannot but settle their disagreement through violence. They can't settle it through rationality. Whereas if you have someone who doesn't have any of those kind of basic foundational beliefs, they are able to break down those beliefs and settle a disagreement through a rational debate. In the same way that individuals that only accepted the same, I don't know, going back to my desire to show someone a proof that genocide is wrong, if you have the same basic set of logical tenets, or whether that's in mathematics or kind of propositional logic, you can go back and say, where was the flaw in your proof? Let's find it together because we agree about the same axioms. Whereas if you're in a situation where people are allowed to hold different kind of foundational beliefs or truths, they're in a situation where they are inevitably going to get to a point where no amount of rational disagreement can settle that dispute. And one might hypothesize that such would be more likely to lead to violence when is there potential for only settling a dispute through that and not through rational debate. So I think that's the marginal advantage the skeptic has. I think it's a minor advantage because I do take the point that I think individuals still can have perhaps at least some amount of violence comes from a society that you're raised in, not the philosophy that you're espousing. And so individuals might take on themselves violence not out of disagreements, but directly out of anger or out of something like that. But I do think there's a certain level of violence or negative things that come from disagreements that can't be settled because individuals have kind of foundational beliefs that are in some way unshakable or can't be settled through a certain level of rational debate. But I'm not sure.
Yeah, okay. I think I'm convinced that on that particular point, yeah, I think you might be right that when you have people who are strongly committed to beliefs, maybe that does result in more violence. So I suppose with respect to this point about settling disagreement, I would see rationality as a sort of constraint on all areas of inquiry, and not all areas of inquiry, in my view, aim at settling disagreement. So although although I can agree with you that there might be problems, and well, I mean, I think it's absolutely true, right? Like, clearly there are problems when people are dogmatic in their beliefs, right? That often leads to violence, and maybe I have to judge some of those people as being rational. So like maybe when I look at, I don't know, a religious war or something, I am going to be committed to saying that it's rational. Of course, rationality isn't the only criterion on which we judge people, right? I might have moral objections, for instance. So yeah, I think that when I when I look at rationality in general, I want to say, well, like this is a constraint on inquiry, right? So when we're engaging in inquiry, we want to be rational, but I don't want to say that rational beliefs have to be such that they achieve consensus or that they avoid disagreement or anything like that. Because ultimately, I mean, there are lots of situations where, maybe I'm more interested in just exploring ideas rather than on settling on like the one true idea. I mean, I certainly think that like in philosophy, my goal really isn't to get people to agree with me. Maybe I want them to agree with me on some things, but I actually think there's probably quite a lot of value in allowing the flourishing of lots of different ideas and allowing those ideas to make themselves stronger in conflict, as it were. And actually, that's probably also the case in science. I think there are lots of situations in the context of science where it's useful to have people with different perspectives, and so agreement isn't necessarily the goal. Where we have to settle disagreements, I think there are usually what we will usually do is develop institutions or conventions in order to achieve that. In the context of religion, for instance, I mean, I think there are plenty of countries in the world that have kind of more specific conventions and institutions that like allow people of different religions to live together without violence. They don't ultimately have to come to an agreement with each other. I mean, if you're like here in the UK, there's lots of people with different religious views. It doesn't really matter because the nature of our like social system, the way that our institutions are designed, are just able to kind of absorb that diversity of opinion. Generally speaking, I mean, obviously it's imperfect, but we live in an imperfect world. That's never going to change. So yeah, I mean, does that make sense? Like, I don't necessarily see agreement as being a constraint, and I think there are other ways of achieving. Well, there are other ways of achieving the sort of goods that you would have with agreement through the right kinds of conventions and institutions.
No, I definitely take the initial point that, particularly in perhaps the fields of science, that disagreement is actively a good thing, that individuals pursuing different paths or working in different paradigms around similar problems may actually allow us to figure things out, or at least get scientific tools that are more useful, because there may be some situations in which one paradigm is more successful at achieving a goal, and other situations in which another paradigm. I mean, you think of how do we explain an individual electron? It's represented in different ways, from computer science to, electrical engineering to physics. They understand electrons in different ways, and working with those different models may actually be particularly useful for achieving a goal. So I definitely take that point. I think that that's a very good point around that our goal may not be achieving the truth of what is electron, but maybe to have some sense of using different models to achieve goals out of science. I think when it comes to kind of shifting over to more, ethics and justice and political philosophy, I think it becomes more challenging when there isn't a certain level of value. So it makes me think of, debates around what might be described as kind of communitarian nationalism, ideas that you should have essentially nation states that are all people of the same culture, and therefore they have the same values and they share that. And so you don't have disagreements around values because they all have the same background and culture. Ideas of civic nationalism, where you have kind of binding ideas of the state, but many different cultures existing within that state. And so there's a couple shared principles of whether that's human rights and democracy or whatever that bind many different groups with many values together. Or kind of, a cosmopolitan sense where we don't have a strong connection to national values or even nations. at all. But I do think there's a real challenge that goes back and forth between those of the challenge both of having a state or a country that does not have some level of, at the very basic, some level of shared principles, whether that's we settle our disagreements through debate, not civil war, or we settle it at the ballot box, or we have respect for minorities, or whatever that is, having some level of that. And I think the communitarian makes a stronger case that, no, you need to have a shared cultural heritage in these things. And I think there's all sorts of reasons you can disagree with that view. But I do think there's a real challenge there of it becomes harder to make decisions in contexts where our goal is a social choice procedure of figuring out what are we going to decide to do as a small town, as a country, as what have you. Then it becomes really challenging when you have different values or different basic things that you're assuming or taking for granted, if that makes sense. And then I think it's more of a challenge. So I definitely, I will agree with you and take your point that I think within the sciences, having that disagreement is helpful, but I do think there's a real challenge for kind of the process of whether that nation building or country building and community building around not having at least some level of shared values or goals, but I'm not sure.
Do you think, though, that even if we accept this communitarian thesis, that it requires us to judge people with different values as being irrational? I feel like there are ways that we can achieve shared value systems without entering into discussions of rationality. And in fact, in practice, I suspect that the kind of inculcation of values isn't really it's when you raise a child, right, and the parents inculcate them with certain values, or they get certain values from the education system and so on. I mean, I don't think there's usually any explicit talk about which values are more or less rational. I think people tend to just kind of pick up their values. Well, I'm not actually sure. I'm not sure of the psychological process, but it's more a matter of shaping people's sentiments and emotions. And it seems to me like I can say, well, yeah, I don't think there was anything irrational about, say, the value system of, I don't know, ancient Sparta, right? But I sure as hell would not want to live there. I think it's awful, and I think there's good reasons to resist those sorts of values becoming common over here. Again, I would just see this as like it doesn't require viewing these people as being irrational. I think there are other ways of resisting.
And I don't think necessarily saying that in one set of values is rational and another set is irrational. I think the challenge is finding a way to, if you are going to accept both as rational, finding the way to say these different value systems, and when at least I'm saying value systems, have some set of beliefs about ethics, perhaps, or about what is good, that are going to be held to, that are axiomatic in some sense. That there is not a clear way to settle a disagreement between individuals, that it's always going to be a certain level of confrontation between groups that have inherently different value systems. And I mean, I don't know. I don't have a sense of if there's a good way to handle this or a bad way to handle those disagreements, but it does seem to me that there exist within many countries today groups of individuals that hold values which are completely incommensurate and can't be settled through a process of discussion, because the basic tenets that they hold, sometimes about ethics, sometimes about metaphysics and the concept of reality when it comes to things like religion, are so different as to not be able to be settled. And my concern as the skeptic is not to say that one group is right and one group is wrong, but rather to say that the idea of holding on to those basic values at the bottom of things might be the problem.
Yeah, okay. I suppose this brings us to this question, the third concern that you had, which is it good to hold beliefs unjustified? Because I think I agree with you that there are problems you know, associated with people taking these sorts of strong commitments, right? I agree with that. I don't want to say that they're irrational, and at least not necessarily. I mean, obviously, I'm going to say some people are irrational, but yeah. So the fact that there are people in, I mean, look, there are plenty of people in my country who have values that I think are just awful, right? But not necessarily irrational. Now, I suppose I mean I'm not sure that it would help if they were merely proposing those values in a way that would be acceptable to the skeptic, if they were merely hypothesizing those values or whatever. But I would also say that I think that sometimes it can be very useful to be strongly committed to certain views in the context of political action. I mean, in some cases, it can be literally a matter of life or death, right? If you're opposed to something the government is doing, and you know, there are some countries in the world where, like, you know, there can be severely negative consequences for protesting, and it seems to me that one of the benefits of holding beliefs, holding a sort of stronger commitment than merely hypothesizing, is that it will provide you with the motivation to you know, to really assert those values. I think there have been plenty of cases historically where we can like look at people who were very strongly committed to certain views, and it's probably a good thing. And there are plenty of cases where it's a bad thing as well. But you know, I see this as being kind of a feature of my view of rationality, right? Because it sort of allows that all of these might well count as being perfectly rational. It's really just a matter of temperament. You know, some people are going to be more bold. Some people are going to sort of hold beliefs with more confidence. Some people more timid, and that's fine.
But it seems to me that there's a certain level of the content of those beliefs does seem to matter, and I don't know, from my perspective, once again, from that desire that there's or hope that we could go out and prove that some of these people are holding beliefs that are in some way really justified, and some of these people are holding beliefs that are deeply problematic. I mean, there are, just because one is protesting in the streets doesn't mean that one isn't protesting because they want the genocide to come back or something else horrible, right? There's a certain level of, just because you have a firmly held belief doesn't necessarily mean you're doing something good. And in fact, it seems that people who have beliefs that are subject to rational disagreement and debate might be more open to finding something that's more accurate. And I think this goes to perhaps my hope and your lack of hope that we could one day find something, a truth about the right and wrongness of actions or things, and that would be found through a process of debate, not a process of kind of instilled values. And I think there's like I said, a hope that I have that individuals, that it's not that it just happens that, I don't know, history is written by the victors, and so whoever won, we decided that whatever they were standing for was right, but rather that through a real process of some level of rational debate, individuals that are observing, those individuals who are standing by their values or protesting for something, make up their minds because they think through some level of rational argument, and not just yay, they stood for their principles, but oh wow, what they're saying makes sense. That was what won the day. And perhaps this is an armchair philosopher that hopes that the world gets settled by people who think through arguments rationally and not by people who have strong beliefs and strong views and fight for them. But there's some level of, I wish that the world were a place where it were, I don't know, rational disagreements or these things that settled the issues, as opposed to, I don't know, whoever can yell the loudest or the strongest.
I mean, I should clarify, I suppose, that I think that it is a requirement of rationality that you engage in some sort of critical reflection on your beliefs and values. And the reason why I see that as a requirement on rationality is because, so as I've said, I think that one of the constraints is that rational beliefs have to support successful action, and it seems to me, and I mean I could be wrong about this, but it seems to me that you're much more likely to be successful in achieving your goals if you engage in critical reflection, right? If you don't just blindly follow, I don't know, whatever somebody has told you, maybe like some authority has told you something. Don't just be, blindly dogmatic about things. So, I mean, yeah, I absolutely want people to be critical, but I do think that there can be some good in holding belief where that involves, maybe even involves certainty. Like, I mean, as I've said, I'm not particularly certain about, well, I'm not certain about anything. I'm a fallibilist, but I'm not sure that it's always a problem. So, yeah.
Yeah. No, I think that's a good point. I am not confident and don't know if holding beliefs sometimes can be a good thing, and it very well may be. Like I said, I have a desire to hold strong beliefs, and so there's some part of me that wants it to be a good thing, even if I'm not sure if it is. I do like the addition of kind of critical reflection as a component to rationality, because it does seem that, unfortunately, there are, if we think to politics, there are individuals that, despite a complete lack of critical reflection, can have a certain degree of success by simply, I don't know, abusing psychological facts of humanity to gain support or gain power, despite a complete lack of critical reflection. And so I do like adding that or having that as a component, but in my mind, having it as a separate component, not simply as a process of, well, critical reflection will probably support successful action. So as long as you're being successful in your actions, you probably have some level of critical reflection. In my mind, having it as a separate component could be a useful piece, because I'm worried about those individuals who are successful through, like I said, abusing psychological fallacies of humanity towards whoever, I don't know, yells the loudest and beats their chest the strongest, as it were. So, but I do like that idea of having critical reflection, because I think that can be a critical component that can perhaps shift some of the talk of rationality, of saying both that individuals that disagree can still be rational, while also saying, but at the end of the day, if you're not actually engaging in critical reflection, and that critical reflection hopefully can get you to a point of all arriving at a similar result, that you're not in some way rational. But
you made this point about individuals, like politicians, exploiting fallacies. I think there's kind of two things we might be looking at there, because I think that actually a lot of the politicians who do that are very successful, but I'm not entirely sure that they are in fact unreflective. I think that a lot of them are probably very smart, and they have figured out ways of manipulating people. As for the population who follow them, I'm not sure that the population are actually successful. At least if they are, I mean, if somebody's been like hoodwinked by an authority figure, they may well have ended up, I don't know, voting against their own interests. I think this is something that does happen. So, I think even in that example, I would say, well, like, you have one person who's engaging in critical reflection and has actually been remarkably successful. Unfortunately, their goals are not as humanitarian as we might hope. And then you have other people who maybe should have been engaging in a bit more reflection. So yeah, that's, I guess, my response to that sort of case. I don't know if that was necessarily like a really important point or anything, but I just...
No. I think it's an interesting point. I think it's... I honestly think it may depend on the politician. I think there are some politicians that are very good at perhaps playing a part or appearing to be acting in a certain way and are very reflective about the way that they do things. I think there are other politicians that lack complete access to that critical reflection.
Yeah.
But that may be my own bias. I don't know.
I think probably the best counterexample to my view here would be somebody like Donald Trump, because he was obviously very successful, and I mean, maybe his beliefs were consistent in some sense, but yeah. Do I want to say that
Whereas
he's a paradigm of rationality?
Whereas it
I'm not
seems,
sure.
and correct me if I'm wrong, because I don't know, I mean, certainly don't know as a skeptic, but UK politics as well, it seems to me a figure like Boris Johnson often feigns a certain level of lack of reflection where he may be more reflective in reality. But
Oh yeah, so I mean,
incorrect.
I don't, yeah, so like Donald Trump, troubles this particular view because I don't think he's reflective, but Boris
Yeah,
Johnson I think probably is.
yeah.
So you know, I mean, again, I don't know, I can't get inside his head, but I think I think the bumbling sort of
Hmm.
he puts on a persona, which I think is
Yeah.
quite carefully crafted. So yeah. Uh, Let me. So I suppose just to maybe try to end this point,
Hmm.
end this part with a point of agreement. I think that, and I'm not sure whether you agree with this, but I think one of the things I would say is that you know there's rationality, right, and that is one of the constraints on inquiry. But then there's a whole load of rules and conventions beyond rationality. And we often rely on those rules and conventions when we need to have consensus. A place like a courtroom is, I suppose, the kind of perfect example of this because, like, in a courtroom, you have very precise, well, at least when they work well, I suppose you have very precise rules for how you're going to get to a particular judgment. I mean, I suppose if it's like a
Hmm.
jury, then ultimately it's democratic. It's a matter of, well, what do those 12 people judge? And so there are rules for like what counts as appropriate arguments, and there are rules for how you form a judgment. But those aren't rules of rationality. I mean, it wouldn't necessarily be irrational to think that a jury has come to the wrong decision, and it wouldn't necessarily be irrational to consider arguments that would not be acceptable, in the context in the courtroom itself. I mean, imagining like skeptical hypotheses, like if somebody's committed a murder, it's not going to be a very good argument for the defense to say, well, maybe we're all brains in vats or something like that, right?
Hmm.
So I think that there are rules beyond rationality, and I mean, I'm assuming that would have to be the case for a skeptic as well, because from my point of view, I suppose I'm saying that there's like a whole load of beliefs that are rationally justified, whereas your view is, well, none are rationally justified, right? Like, but we still ultimately have to, at some point, come to a decision. I mean, is that something that you could
Yeah.
agree with?
So I mean, I think it's a good point around rules and what rules we're following. I think that I have a desire that there is a set of rules that we could follow in the, I don't know, a set of reason or a set of rational rules that one could sit down and follow and agree to. I think the challenges are that such a set of rules is often difficult to come to, and even within the basics of simple logical frameworks, you have a range of different possible logics that people could be setting out within an agreement or a disagreement. And so I think that finding a good set of rules to base something on, and it's that desire that I have that everything is in some way like a jury trial, that there's a clear set of rules, and if you follow these rules, you'll arrive at a conclusion. And clearly, there are any number of flaws with any legal system you look at, but that stipulation, at least in its form, of that there's a set of rules, and if we followed that set of rules, we would arrive at the right conclusion. I desire for that to be something that happens, but as a skeptic, I'm not sure if such a set of rules really does exist, or if rationality is something that it seems something that's desirable to me, but I don't know if it's right, or true.
Mhm.
So I don't know how that fits into your thoughts, but that was what was coursing through my head.
Okay, yeah. I'm actually I'm on the fence about rationality as well. Maybe I don't know. Would I say that it's right or true? Maybe not. Maybe it's not even a good thing. Who knows? But yeah, okay. Um,
Cool.
I don't know if there was anything else you wanted to bring up in this
No,
context.
nothing else. I mean, first off, just thanks so much for taking the time to chat with me. I think this has been really interesting, and it's been really fun to kind of engage on some of these ideas and go back and forth on them. It's very interesting. I would make a pitch. I'm going to make a pitch because I'm a shameless YouTuber, and this is what I do. For anyone that's interested and has watched through whatever it is, an hour and 40 minutes of this video, hopefully you're a diehard and you're interested in these things. I'm putting together a new channel that I have that's looking at some experimental philosophy questions, some artificial intelligence stuff in a very, I don't know, weak AI sense of playing with topic modeling and trying to get computers to understand philosophical texts. I just put out a video on feeding all of the dialogues of Plato into this topic modeling system that tries to sort them out into different topics without, the system doesn't have any context for what any of the words mean. It's just kind of trying to put the symbols next to each other and trying to play with some of the ideas of, are computers smart enough to do philosophy yet? So if anyone's interested in that, the channel is ExPhi. And so wanted to give a quick pitch for that, but yeah.
Yeah, I'll put a link to that in the description anyway, so you know it'll be available to people right from the start.
Fantastic. But otherwise, yeah, no, this is fantastic. Like I said, it was great to chat. If ever in the future you want to have a chat for a while about something, I'm always available.
Okay, yeah, cool.
And always available to procrastinate for 3 months and then eventually put something together. Let me frame it like that.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thanks for that. That was really good. I will. Yeah. Maybe in the future we could have another conversation about something else. But I think
Sure.
there was some good content there. So I will stop the recording just now.
Great.
So goodbye, YouTube.